Anna Batchelor, please.
Good Lasky Hirlik, and welcome to the House, Minister Madigan, and thank you for outlining the position as regards special education provision. And certainly, as other colleagues have done across the House, I think we all very much welcome the announcement that that special schools will be reopening from this Thursday at 50% capacity. And I think we all I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the Labour Group, as others have done, just the hard work that has gone into ensuring that reopening, and to commend the hard work of all those involved, parents, reps, unions and staff and education partners, and to commend them for the work. And of course also to welcome the fact that children in special classes in mainstream schools will be returning on 22nd February, and again that's very welcome, and you've outlined other plans. However, on a broader level, I think we need to acknowledge much more, and not just acknowledge, but actually put in place practical recognitions for the enormous deprivation for our children, particularly children with additional needs. But all our children who have missed out and been denied education now for the last few weeks, but also for the months of last year. And I know others have mentioned children with additional needs in mainstream schools. I'm thinking of children I know with autism or children with Down syndrome who participate in a normal way, in a normal year, I should say, in a normal school year. They participate in mainstream classes, and who still, they and their peers in the mainstream classes still do not have any clarity or certainty as to when their classes will be reopening or when their schools will be reopening. And I know there are enormous operational and logistical difficulties with partial reopenings and with blended teaching at primary and secondary level of in-person and remote learning. That's very, very difficult for school boards and principals. Any of us on school boards are well aware of that, to try and manage that. So it may well be that the more practical resolution is to open schools, all schools, for all pupils when transmission rates allow. But I think we have to acknowledge the enormous impact upon children with additional needs and children more generally on the lack of certainty and lack of clarity about when they will be going back to school. I see, various indications being given that once special classes in mainstream schools have reopened fully from February 22nd, that then it may be that primary schools in full, including obviously all classes, will be in a position to reopen from early March. Secondary schools, less certainty about reopening dates. But it's this lack of clarity that's causing such trauma and distress to so many students. All of us have been contacted by individual parents who have children with additional needs, where they really can see the regressive impact of being deprived of education upon those children. A very heartfelt article in yesterday's Sunday Independent by Sarah Caden, giving voice to some of the children affected, quoting a mother who voiced her feeling of being left behind, a child who is again with additional needs, but in a mainstream class, and therefore has no certainty about when he can go back. And I know, Minister, as you've said, you are putting in place the 5 hours per week of home-based teaching and care support, but clearly this is not a sustainable long-term resolution. It doesn't address the real needs of such children. In the Dáil, my colleague and Labour Education spokesperson Eoin Ó Ríordáin has called on you, Minister, to remain in contact with Minister Donnelly also to secure more clarity on vaccinations for teachers and SEN staff as soon as possible. So, these are issues on which some clarity and certainty is needed. It's clear, although, as I say, we haven't really seen a very practical recognition of this, but it is clear that school closures have already had severe impacts on children with additional needs, on vulnerable children and children in special schools, as we all know. But what we need to do looking forward is to ensure, as I said, that there is a recognition in practice of what those detrimental impacts have been. We need to see clarity on the impacts that this has had. I've seen much more in the British press about this. They've done so badly, generally, the British government, on COVID in so many ways. And yet, as long ago as last summer, the British government were putting in place billions of pounds into a catch-up fund to ensure that all children with additional needs and children in mainstream schools, all children would be able to catch up on the education and related benefits that they had missed out out on through the school closures. You know, we have to recognise that Generation COVID are hugely impacted by this. Our children and young people who have missed out on so much. And we're just not seeing, I think, an acknowledgement of the long-term effect upon those children, or any plan to put in place a catch-up mechanism of the sort that we've seen elsewhere. So I think we need to be looking now at what are our post-COVID supports. We need to look in the short term at what are our dates for return to school for all children in mainstream classes, and we need to look beyond that at what are our post-COVID supports and how do we make it up to the children who because they have additional needs have really seen regression, and to all of our children who've been deprived of education over such a long period of time. I suppose, Minister, just to finish, I mean, you know, we've debated in this House COVID policy more broadly, and in the Labour Party we've put forward a proposal for a national aggressive suppression strategy, equivalent of looking to a way of achieving zero COVID while we await the longer-term rollout of vaccinations. And you know, I think, unfortunately, there's been a resistance from government to that. I think that resistance is changing, and I do very much welcome the proposed introduction of mandatory hotel quarantining. But I'm looking at the Dublin Airport arrivals and departures, and I'm seeing flights from Lanzarote, a flight arriving this evening from Lanzarote, and we all have seen the reports about people using Ireland as a backdoor route to, there are still flights allowed into Ireland from Dubai, where Britain has banned them. So I think we need to be much more strict about ensuring we have a containment policy and an elimination policy on COVID. And it's simply not good enough to say it's not practical to close down flights from particular locations where travel is very unlikely to be essential, and yet it's practical to keep children with additional needs deprived of school and deprived of any clarity as to when they'll return to school over such a long period of time. And, you know, this practical point, we've all come to accept almost a sort of Stockholm syndrome, that it's practical for us to be stopped going more than 5 kilometres for exercise, that it's practical for children to be engaged in homeschooling and remote schooling for lengthy periods of time, and for parents to try and work around that. And many of us have been experiencing that. And yet it's not practical to take up the lesson of New Zealand or Australia, of so many other countries who have adopted a much clearer policy and who, as a result, have been able to see their children return to school and to have really reduced the negative impact of COVID within their communities. So, Minister, I just end with this plea. Let's see from government a clear acknowledgement of the impact upon children of closure of education, particularly the impact upon children with additional needs, which I know is your own direct responsibility. And let's see in the short term clarity as to when children in mainstream classes will be returning to school.
Thank you.